Between 1945 and 1954, the Vietnamese waged an anti-colonial war against France and received $2.6 billion in financial support from the United States. The French defeat at the Dien Bien Phu was followed by a peace conference in Geneva, in which Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam received their independence, and Vietnam was temporarily divided between an anti-communist South and a communist North. In 1956, South Vietnam, with American backing, refused to hold the unification elections. By 1958, communist-led guerrillas known as the Viet Cong had begun to battle the South Vietnamese government. To support the South's government, the United States sent in 2,000 military advisors, a number that grew quickly to 16,300 in 1963. The military condition deteriorated, and by 1963, South Vietnam had lost the fertile Mekong Delta to the Viet Cong. In 1965, President Johnson escalated the war, commencing airstrikes on the North Vietnamese and committing ground forces, which numbered in 536,000 troops in 1968. The 1968 Tet Offensive by the North Vietnamese turned many Americans against the war. The next president, President Richard Nixon, advocated Vietnamization, which was withdrawing American troops and giving South Vietnam greater responsibility for fighting the war. Richard Nixon's attempt to slow the flow of North Vietnamese soldiers and supplies into South Vietnam by sending American forces to destroy communist supply bases in Cambodia in 1970, in violation of Cambodian neutrality, provoked anti-war protests on the nation's colleges' campuses. From 1968 to 1973, efforts were made to end the conflict through diplomacy. In January 1973, an agreement reached and U.S. forces were withdrawn from Vietnam and U.S. prisoners of the war were released. In April 1975, South Vietnam surrendered to the North, and Vietnam was reunited.
I became aware of the problems in Vietnam when it was a French territory and the people were rebelling against the French control. French left, and then there was a place called Dien Bien Phu, and that was kind of where the French met their Waterloo. Then then Vietnam split into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. South Vietnam was more friendly to the West. North Vietnam was more friendly to the communist countries. And because of the geography of the North being near Red China and the communist world, they were influenced by them. South Vietnam was influenced by being closer to Australia and other Western countries, and so it was more westernized. North Vietnam and South Vietnam always wanted to be one country, so there was always the probability of a conflict. I had a number of my fraternity brothers that went into the service because they were in ROTC in college. When you go ROTC in college, you have a commitment to military service.
What's the ROTC?
Reserve Officer Training Corps. It's supported by the military. There's actually military functions that are carried on campuses, and there's employees of the armed services that are stationed on campuses that train college-age men and women into becoming officers. You don't. Reserve Officer Training Corps means after you graduate, you go into the service as an officer. It's a good source of hiring quality officers for the military. Well, everybody alive then remembers his death. That was an assassination of a president was just a tumultuous thing, and it caused a great amount of upheaval. He basically didn't listen to Eisenhower. Eisenhower warned about the industrial military complex because the military likes to be as big as they can be, and they're supported by big industrial armament makers, airplane makers like Boeing, Lockheed, Martin Marietta. There are a lot of big companies, Raytheon, Honeywell. There's just a ton of big companies that the majority of their sales are to the Defense Department. The Defense Department has this huge budget, and these big companies pay lobbyists to lobby to get more. We always need the best armament, the best new plane, the best new gun, the best new spy satellite. All of that kind of thing is always what the Defense Department wants, and the congressmen in states that have a heavy concentration of that kind of manufacture, they support that. So there's a big engine that we common people don't have much access to or much influence over. And Eisenhower warned against that, but the threat of communism permeated the press, and so there was this great fear, and to object to that would have been a hard call by Kennedy, and Kennedy didn't make the call. So after he died, Lyndon Johnson took over. He's a hard-nosed Texan. He thinks that we can win anything, and he did the Civil Rights Amendment. I mean, there's a lot of things good that he did, but he also perpetuated the Vietnam War, and he really got sucked in by it. One of the few presidents that didn't run for re-election.
Do you think
communism, as we were to find out, was doomed to fail of its own weight anyway?
Yeah.
But we hadn't learned that yet, and this is all part of the learning process. In retrospect, if you can live life with a rear view mirror, there's a lot of things you wouldn't do. And going into Vietnam is one of those things you wouldn't do. But at the time, we didn't have the benefit of the knowledge that we gained from Vietnam. So we're stuck with it. You can't unring the bell, and that's a lesson that you learn from things like that.